Good morning and welcome. My name is Maureen Kola, and I'm the Acting Executive Director for Clean Technology at Alberta Innovates. I'd like to acknowledge that I am on Treaty 7 territory, the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Nations, including Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai, the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, and the Tsuut'ina Nation. We acknowledge all of the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. Welcome back to those of you who joined us for the previous sessions, and for those joining us for the first time today. We are now into our fourth and final session of the Small Modular Reactors Learn How series. Alberta Innovates is the innovation engine for the province. When a new technology has the potential to benefit Alberta, our teams are keen to explore the opportunities and challenges that those technologies may present. We love to share knowledge, opening up connections for good conversation around energy and clean tech. So we hope this series will spark ideas for you. This series is an opportunity for all Albertans to discover new nuclear technology and to hear more about the SMR action plan, safety and regulations, engagement, and innovation in Canada's nuclear industry. We've got some great content for you today. We will be diving into conversations around energy transition and community engagement. This will be followed by a closing panel highlighting Alberta government, industry, and innovation perspectives on what was heard during the last four sessions and what's coming next. If you missed our first SMR 101 session with NRCan, the Canadian Nuclear Association, and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, or the second session where we discuss the exciting innovations happening in Canada with speakers from New Brunswick, Ontario, and Saskatchewan, or the third session where we featured 9 companies with different SMR technologies and a presentation from the Organization of Canadian Nuclear Industries, you can view it on demand with our Inventures Unbound platform. Now for a few housekeeping items. First off, we will be recording the webinar, and it will be available along with the presenters' slides after the session. We recommend that you log into this webinar using Google Chrome if you haven't already. Now, we want to hear from you. At the bottom of your screen, there are engagement tools, so feel free to use the group chat to say hello and let us know where you are joining from today. Since this is the final session, why don't you let us know if there are any remaining gaps that still need to be discussed or addressed. During the presentations, if you have a question for our speakers, please use the Q&A button to submit a question. You can let me know if you are directing your question to a specific speaker or leave it open for all of our speakers. You can also use the Q&A if you need help with a technical question. Our comms team will be looking out for any issues. I know we won't have enough time today to respond to all of the questions that come in, so we will be capturing the questions that are sent in, and we'll give our speakers the opportunity to reply after the presentation. We will post the questions and responses on our event page. All right, let's dive into our first presentation for today from Alison Krutny. Alison oversees the strategic direction and operations of the Energy Futures Lab, a coalition of innovators and organizations working together to advance solutions to create an energy system that is fit for the future. She supports dozens of entrepreneurs, energy companies, community leaders, and stakeholders in generating opportunities to test, identify, and scale new initiatives and collaborations. Alison, I will now pass the virtual mic over to you.
Thank you, Maureen. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. So yeah, at the Energy Futures Lab, we've been convening diverse stakeholders from across Alberta's energy system and Alberta communities for the past 6 years. And so today I'll share some of what we've learned around the how we approach hosting these conversations on what are generally divisive topics related to our energy future. So here's a quick snapshot of what I'll plan to cover. I was essentially invited to this session today to use the Energy Futures Lab as a case study for how to have productive conversations on polarizing issues, with the assumption that some of what we've learned and applied can be applied and translates well into other contexts and other issues as well, including into exploring SMRs. So I'll plan to share a brief overview of the Energy Futures Lab just to help put some of my comments in context, a little bit on the challenges of polarization and why conversations in this context can be so challenging. And then I'll share some of what we've learned and what has worked in our context, as well as a few example approaches. So yeah, I mean, in essence, the Energy Futures Lab is a place for innovators and leaders to come together, very diverse, intentionally very diverse groups of people is generally who we work with from across the whole energy system. At the core of the lab are 70 Energy Futures Lab fellows or participants, and this is, folks from oil and gas, utilities, renewable energy, IT, finance, indigenous communities, not-for-profits, provincial and municipal governments, economic development, a very diverse group by design. And of course, that means there is a fair bit of disagreement and different perspectives on our energy future. So that's some of what I'll talk about today. The lab is also supported by 20 convening partners. And so I'll be sharing some of the learnings both from working with the fellows that I was just mentioning, as well as the Energy Futures roadshows that have been visiting communities around Alberta to help kind of assist those communities in exploring their challenges and opportunities related to the changing energy system. And here's the 20 convening partners of the Energy Futures Lab who, are in themselves sort of a reflection of the energy system. Again, industry, government, nonprofits, clean tech, some groups from the innovation ecosystem. And these partners lend their support to the Energy Futures Lab in various ways. And I share this slide just for a little bit of context on our approach. And there's certainly lots of groups that are working on the technological innovation required for our shifting energy system, which of course is extremely important and necessary. And, I'd say it's equally as important to attend to the many sort of non-technical barriers that can slow that adoption and scaling of the technology. You may have heard Peter Chertzakian speak to the many insightful lessons that he draws from past energy transitions. And for example, illustrating Thomas Edison's success, not because he invented a light bulb, but because he knew and he was aware that he had to revamp an entire system is what really needed to happen in order to make the shift from gas to electric lighting over 100 years ago. So, it's clear that the right conditions, technological, of course, but beyond that, competitiveness, social, policy, cultural, all need to be in place for any real uptake to occur. And so the Energy Futures Lab is a collaborative platform for connecting these sort of beyond technology pieces together in order to accelerate adoption. So, well, this graphic is a bit older. We've been using it for about 6 or 7 years in the lab. So the content is still relevant. Conversations about energy development, our energy future, climate action have been polarized for many years. And in fact, the Energy Futures Lab was originally conceived in 2015 as a response to polarization around our energy future. And in fact, at the time, no matter who we talked to, no matter what side of the debate any particular person was on, no matter what side of a contentious issue they kind of represented, the one thing that everyone could agree on was that polarization was slowing progress. It was keeping us stuck. It was stopping us from moving forward productively together. And of course, not only does polarization on these issues present sort of false choices that give the impression that and the only option is to pick one side or the other. But it also tends to push people further into their camps, a dynamic that's also often reinforced with social media. So what makes these conversations amongst, diverse stakeholders in a polarized environment so difficult at times? It's probably not surprising, but I took a few minutes here just to kind of jot down a few of my thoughts on that. This is certainly not a comprehensive list, but is a start, and I'm sure many of you could add more to this as well. But with diverse groups, there's invariably, very different worldviews or ways of kind of seeing and making sense of the world. So, which, while we may all be conversing in English in the room, it actually equates to a version of speaking very different languages, which can be challenging when there's not an awareness of that. Similarly, sort of deeply held assumptions about how things are, that especially when not kind of surfaced or examined, can underpin very strong reactions or misunderstandings. Engagement on highly polarized topics are often characterized by a lack of trust. At times, a sort of with us or against us kind of attitude can be in play as well. But certainly, fear of change. It's pretty somewhat universal for humans to not enjoy change too much. And sometimes what's also at play there is a fear of losing what we have or what we value. And then these fears and sometimes the emotions that can go along with it, anger and other strong emotions, can mean that interactions can be very emotionally charged. And then, of course, on heavily polarized issues, there's always many tensions at play, and certainly the reality of power dynamics that, for example, can mean some perspectives are very strongly represented or other voices might not be heard. So now I'll share just some of the ways we've engaged in the lab to support more productive conversations and towards advancing solutions as well. And first, just a comment on multi-stakeholder processes generally, which fairly typically tend to be based in either kind of negotiation or consultation, which in either case, by design, participants tend to show up kind of representing their interests or representing their own point of view, which of course is valuable, and there's certainly a time and a place for that. But at the same time, those types of engagements don't tend to leave a huge amount of room for shifting perspectives and in fact tend to kind of entrench pre-existing views through that engagement, through that style of engagement. And so the Energy Futures Lab was designed as a co-creative space. And this slide sort of kind of meant to summarize visually the way of working in the lab, which I think has some relevant elements for engaging on contentious issues more generally as well. So, the image on the left side is representing participants coming into any sort of engagement space headed in all different directions with very different ideas about what the problem is, what solutions might be, very different ideas about how to move forward and so on. And so we create space for participants to really listen to one another, to understand perspectives that are, or really try to understand perspectives that are very different from their own, and to certainly engage with them. And really, it's about doing the hard work of building trust and social capital across traditional boundaries. So as shown and that's sort of what's shown in the middle image there of kind of spending the time kind of talking things through and really listening to one another. And in the lab, this has resulted in a shared vision for Alberta's energy system, which is on the screen now. And this is the vision for Alberta's energy system as developed by the Energy Futures Lab Fellows. And for the past 5 years, this vision has guided the innovation work in the lab and has generated significant alignment across fellows and partners in the industry. And I think it's a good reminder of the value of taking time to get some form of general alignment towards where we're headed, so that we're not working at cross purposes or working against one another. And really this vision serves as an anchoring point. And so then the work within the lab is looking at how can we build from today's strengths to develop opportunities that move towards that vision. And so finally then getting to the right-hand image, which ultimately is about finding some degree of common ground for working together. We invite people to look for those places where there's enough agreement or opportunity or shared value to kind of justify spending the time working in a collaborative space. And so the circles on the right represent all sorts of different collaborative groups working on various solutions that are sort of more or less heading towards the vision. And I think an important point there is, not everyone has to agree on every piece, but it's like looking for those places where there's enough value to justify and to spend the time working together. And so in practice, in the lab at least, it looks like this. So here's a snapshot of the current portfolio of collaborative initiatives that are being advanced in some way in the Energy Futures Lab, often by groups that haven't traditionally worked together in the past. And it's really the result of taking that time to build trust and engaging creatively to seek innovative solutions that can work for multiple interests. So I've spoken to the value of sort of knowing where we're headed, cultivating shared language and understanding really supports that trust building, and the power of co-creation, which really benefits from, truly from diverse perspectives and views, recognizing that, especially with complex challenges, no one person has all the answers, and it's really those broader perspectives that can ultimately make for stronger solutions. And then I just also wanted to emphasize, though, or just share a bit about the value of something that's, on one hand, relatively simple, and certainly simple to kind of put in place, but can be really supportive for engaging in tough conversations. And that's just simply having some form of group agreements, which are, statements that essentially describe how a group wants to engage together. Here's an example on the screen, which is the group agreements that the lab fellows have created together. And it's certainly additionally powerful when the group creates them together and then can use them to hold one another to account. But certainly a version of this has been really helpful in working at the community level around the province as well. And then the 4 ways of talking and listening, I thought I'd share this as an example because we found it also really helpful at times to share tools that can help people be more mindful about how they're showing up, and being more mindful of the state that they're engaging from in a conversation. And this example, the 4 ways of listening and talking, 4 ways of engaging, is adapted from Adam Kahane's work that he used, for example, in post-apartheid South Africa. And so just to talk through it a little bit, it's, when listening from a downloading mode, the listener is essentially projecting their own ideas and beliefs onto the speaker, which you could kind of argue is barely listening at all in some ways. In a debating mode, the listener kind of is coming from a place of essentially listening in order to kind of judge whether or not they agree. So it's kind of, and often that kind of means preparing their next argument as well, which, both of these totally fine for everyday conversations or quick interactions, but certainly neither tends to generate new understandings. And so just kind of sharing some of this at the beginning of engagement sometimes can help people to kind of just have more self-awareness and kind of lean into, kind of decide where they want to engage from. And certainly, reflective mode is listening, kind of seeking to understand where the speaker is coming from. So really, and engaging in this way can really support trust building. And finally, that generative mode is where the listener is really trying to truly appreciate or kind of try on a speaker's perspective. And, as I was alluding to earlier, this can be a very creative space where new solutions are generated. So I'll close with just 2 examples of techniques we've used in the Energy Futures Lab to host productive conversations around polarizing topics, essentially where there's high complexity, opposing views and interests, and no easy answers. I'll note neither of these are particularly COVID friendly, so haven't been in play much in the past year, but certainly this first one here, the fishbowl, is adaptable to online. And so, a fishbowl conversation is essentially just a conversation happening in the center of a room, a small circle, where everyone else is on the outer circle is just observing and listening. But there's always an empty chair for anyone who wants to join that conversation, can step forward at any time and contribute as well. And this is a picture from a fellow workshop where we were addressing a couple particularly timely and challenging topics. One around how, this was early last year, how to reconcile resource development, climate action, and Indigenous land rights. And And there was another conversation that day that I believe was around common ground between conservatives and progressives on energy transition. And we found this method just to be really effective for, working through these controversial or difficult topics that, in other contexts tend to blow up and quickly get into a fairly non-productive space at times. And just a couple of comments there from participants on the side, noting the value of, examining the issue from multiple angles and really surfacing a method for really surfacing some of those underlying tensions or issues. And then another one, which hopefully we'll be able to use again one day when we can meet together in person. You can think about this as, a group conversation in motion, quite literally. So it's a great way to tackle contentious issues with a large group, even groups that don't know one another at all. We've done this with a few hundred people in the room. And in this case, everyone's sort of standing up and moving around the room. And, so a question is posed to the group, and then a participant will make a statement in response. And then everyone literally, like physically, kind of will move closer if they agree or farther away if not. So you'll get kind of immediate sense of how well something resonates with other people in the room. So it's a really useful way to explore both the divergence of views on issues and, as noted by on the slide there by a participant, it's a way of getting like real-time feedback on how well ideas resonate. And it's also a great way to utilize that diversity of perspectives to kind of surface and start to test potential unifying solutions or ideas. And, it can play out for, you can hear from lots of different people in the room, and, people are just continuing to move through the entire engagement. So I think that's what I'll close with, just that value of utilizing some of the, principles as approaches that I've shared today, I think can mean, an opportunity to move from divisiveness or polarization towards elements of co-creation or kind of bridging solutions or collaborative solutions, which in my view is pretty essential to advancing some of the projects and technologies that are needed to address the challenges that we face in these times. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. And I hear your points around maybe activities or ways of chatting in a non-COVID world. And so I'd be interested to see if, platforms like Zoom and Teams are actually going to create ways in which maybe some of that more face-to-face engagement could occur in a sort of a virtual setting. So with that, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Desiree Norwegian. Desiree is a member of the Lidikay, I'm sorry, I said that totally incorrectly, Lidikay First Nation. She is part of the Dene clan, meeting the land of the people from Northwest Territories. Desiree is pursuing her passion through Atunda Inc., and is striving for Indigenous engagement, rights, equality, and reconciliation, greater gender diversity, and engaging in discussions about nuclear power and the advantages it plays in our society in building a clean energy future. Desiree, I will hand it off to you.
Thank you very much. So obviously this first slide you've kind of covered. I am sitting in the traditional territory of the Mishpekautan First Nation, Batchewana First Nation, Pic-Mobert First Nation, Garden River First Nation, and the Métis of Ontario on the beautiful shores of Lake Superior. I am the CEO and founder of Atunda Incorporated. I'm a huge ambassador for Indigenous reconciliation, rights, and equality. Of course, we have an obligation to make sure we build a clean energy future for not just ourselves, but also for our future generations. I also sit on the board for the Organization of Canadian Nuclear Industries as the treasurer, Workplace Wellness Institute as the treasurer as well, and the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business. I really started Atunda Incorporated with that view and passion that we needed to move all of our nations forward. And to do that, we need to educate and make sure that we have power and affordable power to all First Nations, to all people in the North and across Canada. So it is our responsibility for a clean energy future. And I really strive for that through Atunda Incorporated. I do a lot of different work with the Natural Resources of Canada, with First Nations Power Authority, with a lot of different players in the small modular reactor world. And a lot of it I bring back to the First Nations Power Authority, as they are doing a lot of different educational pieces, but they're also a third party who's very mutual to everybody else. So that we talk at First Nations Power Authority about clean energy, and not just a nuclear side. Obviously, nuclear could and has the potential of being a huge game changer in our industry, as it is the base. It could be a base load, but every First Nation is different. So when talking about engagement, we really need to start engagement early. So start including First Nations early. There should be not just a duty to consult, but a duty to include. So that either that's through equity partnerships, stakeholders, employment. To put a small modular reactor on a First Nation takes years of building trusting relationships with that First Nation and figuring out really what they need. What are their needs? Every First Nation is going to be different. They all have different needs, whether it's heating and energy or just heating. So really building on that platform, small modular reactors is going to be a very big game changer, not only for First Nations, but for mining, for forestry. You can put a small modular reactor in the middle of nowhere and let it run, which is a great feature, because currently there are a lot of First Nations in the north that are running on diesel generators. That creates huge, huge power bills, because now you have to truck it there and you have to figure out ways to get it there. And in the winter, there could be an ice road in, and there may not be, meaning how do you get it in? Now you got to fly it in or helicopter it in. That creates really high prices, and it's not affordable. It's not sustainable. It's also not a clean energy. So I see small modular reactors, and clearly it's a passion of mine. I have been in the nuclear industry for 5 years now. I do sit on the Organization of Canadian Nuclear Industries Board. So clearly I'm a huge advocate for nuclear, but that's not the only thing that I talk about. I talk about a lot of different clean energies, such as hydrogen and the actual energy mix. So in regards to that, when you're talking Indigenous engagement in the nuclear realm, you also need to think about the traditional knowledge. Traditional knowledge is a key player, and most of it will be talked about with elders within the community, with the chiefs, with the traditional chiefs. They're the ones who know the land. So before site selection is ever thought of, really you need to start that relationship with the First Nations communities, or with any community for that matter. They have the education and the knowledge of and the traditional knowledge of where it should go, the best sites to put things on. They understand the land. They understand the seasons. They understand what's going on. So long before you do site selection, long before you even start the planning, you really need to start building relationships. That is the key. Along with that comes education. Items such as this forum, right? Alberta Innovates is educating people to what's out there. Nuclear power is going to be a game changer, but you have to be open and willing to that change. So First Nations Power Authority, their core values, and they are a not-for-profit organization that really is there for the people. They're there to help bridge those gaps. They're there to help with power purchase agreements. They're there to help with the engagement side. As you can see on the slide, Guy Lonechild is the CEO of First Nations Power Authority, and the vision for First Nations Power Authority must be guided by the inherent rights and obligations as Indigenous people. This is a treaty relationship vision that is shared by our elders and our leaders, putting this vision to work towards tangible opportunities for large-scale energy infrastructure transformation and energy conservation. So as you can see from this, they don't just advocate small modular reactors, they advocate for all clean energy and moving all of our First Nations forward. To do this, I strongly believe that education is the key, and each one of us has it within us. It is our rights, it is our duty. When you talk about Dene law, you talk about education. Yes, you may have learned something, but it's your right to pass it along, to inform people, to educate people, and to move us all forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Desiree. So our next presenter will be Chelsea Clausen. Chelsea grew up in small town Northern Ontario, and she connects her humble roots to all aspects of her work by listening intently and integrating stakeholder feedback into major project design using a whole of project approach. Her empathetic and proactive approach ensures that local cultural traditions are respected and social risks are managed. Chelsea leads the community engagement practice at Hatch, helping clients reach meaningful solutions that meet community and company needs. So with that, Chelsea, I'll hand it off to you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Maureen. And thank you to Alberta Innovates for having me this morning. Great presentations, Desiree and Allison. And I think that this presentation folds really, really well into what you've learned already. I'm going to talk specifically about SMRs and site selection, which is something that happens very early on in the process. I know a lot of organizations are going through this right now. And there are some elements to consider when you think about community, when you think about stakeholders. And hopefully, my hope today anyway, is that you walk away from this presentation with something that you can learn and use in your own organization. So before I start into it, there are a few items that I'm going to address, but it's probably good to give an overview of why site selection is really important. Of course, when you think about certain site selections, they're static in a way. For example, when you think about oil and natural gas development, you have a reservoir and you need to be close to that reservoir. SMRs, just as Desiree had mentioned, are a bit different in that respect, and there is some flexibility around that. Of course, there are technical needs that need to be met, and things like soil stability, for example. But when you're thinking about community engagement and community risk assessment, that's something that is a little bit more nimble. And there's things that we need to consider when we're thinking about a site selection. There's one statistic that always resonates with me, and it came out by Harvard Business Review. 74% of projects are halted due to this non-technical risk. So coming from an engineering company, this may be probably interesting for you to hear, but I think that we should be focusing more on those non-technical risks, things like, environmental, regulatory, government, but community and Indigenous engagement is so, so important in that. So when considering SMR development, it needs to be looked at with a lens that thinks about transitional technologies. And when you think about community engagement and transitional technologies, this is definitely an inflection point. This is brand new. And in other provinces where nuclear may be not new, like New Brunswick, Ontario, for example. Saskatchewan is getting into it now. But there's things to consider that community members may be concerned about. And I'm going to talk about a few of those things today. So again, my hope is that you're going to walk away from this presentation learning something new and be able to use that within your own organization. So I'm going to cover 3 different questions today. First, SMRs and community. So what topics are really driving concern? So we're seeing that right now in the engagement that Hatch is doing on behalf of our clients. I'm going to share some of that with you. There's time well spent in understanding your own risk tolerance as an organization. So it's, have you paid attention to who and what you're considering for any type of engagement activity that you're planning to undertake? What is your own company willing to do? Or should you be doing your own internal risk assessment to see if you should move on from a project, not participate at all, or think about the things you're willing to do to manage that risk? And I'm going to talk through some of those aspects. And the last one is, after the assessment, after you've made that decision of taking on an inherent amount of risk, how can you convert that to value? So how can you convert that social risk, in which we look at as a fatal flaw in a project, move it on to what's the value and contribution that can offer? And it is a bit of a mind switch, but I'm hoping to take you there today, because I think that there is a lot of value offered from a social perspective. So let's get into the really interesting topic in my view first, which is SMRs and community. What topics are driving concern? So as we start to work with different clients in different locations, there are certain topics that are really driving concerns with SMRs. So first, it's this mechanisms of engagement. So what we hear often is there's a need for face-to-face dialogue. Of course, as Allison had mentioned earlier, that's a bit more challenging with COVID-19, but we've found ways around that. Things like like virtual open houses, or the good old-fashioned work with somebody in the community to put newsletters in mailboxes. Things like that, and getting back to grassroots communication work really, really, really well. Timing of engagement is coming too late, and there's a need for an earlier process. I hear this over and over again, and Desiree touched on this as well. Early engagement is so, so important. Of course, the balance needs to be made between setting expectations and too early of engagement. And that's something that inside your own organization you need to consider to be aligned with the project delivery schedule. Discuss and understand land use instead of just asking how to mitigate impacts. This is a flaw I see quite often, and one that isn't intentional in my view. It's just that the regulatory process seems to be followed step by step. And what I'm saying, and the advice that I'm giving, is that instead of just asking to mitigate impacts through a regulatory process, think about and seek to understand the land use in its current form by all stakeholders. Engaging with grassroots representatives is extremely important. So elders, youth, teachers, community associations, instead of only going to the government-appointed representatives. That is a all-inclusive engagement process, because that information may not be funneling down, and it should never be assumed that it is. The last one on mechanisms of engagement I'll mention is that this discussion on financial inclusion is coming up more and more often. So this desire to have equity share, for example, in different projects, or a partnership agreement in place. I find that communities, and rightfully so, are becoming more savvy in this respect. And so it's something to consider when you're engaging in an early basis. Is there something that, again, going back to your own tolerance in your own organization, what are you willing to do, and how are you willing to engage? The next one here on waste, I think this one is pretty straightforward. Desiree touched on it a bit. Who owns it and how is it disposed? Those are two important questions that need to be answered, and ones that come up quite often. Transportation of fuel. These are all questions that you might say, well, this is really connecting to nuclear in the sense like the larger CANDU reactors, for example. But these are questions on transitional technologies that need to be answered. People are looking for added insights into this brand new technology that's coming. Environmental monitoring, and then land management. So the inclusion in environmental monitoring, yes, as an organization, you're committed to environmental monitoring, but how can you start to include local community stakeholders in that process as well? So it's almost like you do the assessment, but I do the assessment too. And that builds credibility and trust between you and your stakeholders. And then these decommissioning provisions. So will the community be left with the burden afterwards? That's a question that definitely needs to be answered. And then worried about deregulation in the future of incentivizing the business. So governments are looking at SMRs as being an opportunity for an energy future, but stakeholders in the vein that I'm hearing it are worried that if government is so interested in SMR development, are they still maintaining a very strong and stringent regulatory process through this, or are they incentivizing industry to come over with not a strong regulatory process? And the answer to that is, of course, it's a strong regulatory process, but it needs to be conveyed, and a regulator needs to remain in arm's distance to support that. So what is your risk tolerance as an organization? This is a very important question to answer. And when you think about doing any type of risk review, a due diligence needs to be undertaken. So have you taken the time to understand your own risk tolerance? Where are you willing to put your time and energy? And there's 3 different buckets that I have here: manage, modify, or move on. And when you do the risk, especially the social risk assessment, and I'm going to go through that in just a moment to show you what stakeholders to be evaluated and what to consider with each of these stakeholders, you're going to come out with a result that's either going to be, you're going to manage the risk, you're comfortable with the current risk of that site that you've chosen, You're going to modify your project to make sure that you're meeting the expectations of your stakeholders and therefore managing your risk. Or perhaps it's an area that the threshold of your own risk tolerance does not meet, and you're going to move on from that area. And that's the beautiful part about doing a social risk assessment through site selection, is that you have usually a bucket of 12 sites, 15 sites to start with, and you move down to narrow it down to a few areas. And my suggestion always is that community engagement and social acceptability should always be part of that initial review, because there may be some areas that are more apt and open to accepting things like SMR technology. And once you've decided on these three different areas, which I will say in working with different clients that they're based on two different factors. One, does the client have the resources available to support or manage any potential risks that could come up? And two, like I mentioned before, risk tolerance. So in understanding what bucket you fall into, you're better prepared to manage or limit your social risk. And then you can develop the right protocol and plans to do that. Now, there are certain stakeholders to consider, and I'm not going to go through all these in detail, list them out. You can see them there. But what I will do is mention in my slides after this what you should be looking out for with all of these different stakeholders. So as you can see, and what you can pull away from this is that the bucket is big, so there are a lot of stakeholders to consider. It's not just one or two. It goes right across the entire spectrum, and each are very important. Each have different influences in community, and none should be disregarded. So it really should be an all full assessment. Now, when you consider motivations and considerations or red flags with some of the stakeholders, and by no means is this an all-inclusive assessment on what you're going to see now with these panels on the screen, but they're meant to give you some ideas of what to consider when you're thinking about all these different stakeholders. So when you think about communities, for example, being a community partner, thinking about legacy contributions that have taken place, what has happened in the community before, things like economic and training targets, maybe they have some engagement expectations, all those things need to be considered. Previous projects may have happened in the community, and if they haven't, that's also something to consider. Indigenous groups, Desiree went into this in detail, so I won't go into a great degree, but it's also about being a partner with Indigenous communities. IBAs and through the environmental assessment, things like cultural awareness to different communities. One that always resonates with me is I was working with a community, and it was really important to have moose and goose season. And to that community, that meant that if you were going to build any employment targets, that means that spring, goose, fall, moose season needed to be blocked off. So it's important to know those things because they're culturally relevant to the communities. Unions, employees, and contractors, very, very important. What is the labor market like in that community? Not only to fulfill the expectations for your own project, but rather are there precedents set with other industry? Media could be the potential watchdog, and I've worked with media many times over, have a lot of respect for what they do, and they can be a vocal advocate for the client as well. They can be a vocal advocate for you. Internal clients, these are your best advocates. These are your employees. These are the people on the ground. An understanding of your internal clients also important. Investors, if you have any, do they have certain expectations, including environmental, social, and governance expectations? Customers, especially if you're in consumer goods, that is really important. ENGOs, special interest groups, and academia. So, will they detract or support from client steps for SMR development? And will that take away or encourage your focus? So, we heard from Allison earlier on, and there's a lot of great ideas there about convening and bringing together different views. So that's something to definitely consider during your social assessment for site selection. The last three here, I'm sure many on the phone belong to these three groups. So industry, it is especially important to understand the precedents that have been set and consider this as a basement. And what I mean by that is it is not your ceiling. This is where you're starting from when you think about what you are going to be be doing with the community in the future. Government, expectations may vary. They have platforms of different interest. That needs to be considered too. Is there interest to advance SMR technology or not? And is this an area that may have appetite to advocate to their constituents on your behalf? And regulators as well. Meeting regulators' expectations is really important. So when you're thinking about site selection process, are you going to be able to do that? And especially through the new Impact Assessment Act, this is critical. So after the assessment, what is next? And this is the final thought that I'll leave you on, which is this conversion from social risk, even though I've talked a lot about social risk, to social opportunity. And that's talking about social outcomes. So outcomes, in my view, are dual purpose. So it's an interest in financial and social pursuit with a long-term vision. So SMR development has a very long-term vision. You're thinking about how you're going to be a partner with your community. So you should consider things like the social risk and reputation that we just went through. How can we improve that social risk and reputation? Or are you starting from a really good place where you're moving north instead of south? And if you are planned to move south in that direction, is there something that can be done to avoid it? Thinking about environment, social, and governance and your investors is really important. So they may have some expectations. So when you're thinking about this financial and social pursuit with a long-term vision, is there something that you can do to start to incorporate these ESG standards and ESG ratings? Your talent pipeline, very, very important. It makes a lot more sense to have local people employed at your site than fly-in people and bear that cost. So in fact, making that investment is not a risk. It's a huge social value and a great impact to your bottom line. Outcomes-led decision-making, this goes on the governance of the local community as a participant in the project and an owner in the project. And I don't mean an owner financially when I say that. I mean an owner intrinsically. And so if there is ownership in the decision-making process, you definitely have a project that has an outcome that's community-focused, which we've seen time and again play out extremely well. And then also, if there are some tough decisions and conversations to be had that may not be in line with community vision, that's fine. But as long as the local stakeholders have been there at every step of the process. Stakeholder and community buy-in, that leads into what I had said earlier. And the very last one, which is really important, and I see the trend going in this direction, is partnerships and collaboration. So thinking about new ways to partner with local stakeholders creates that social value to the fullest extent. They are now owners in the project and partners in the project and hold a share of equity. So I hope that gave the audience some insight into things to consider when you're thinking about site selection and you're thinking about the ways to assess the community impact on site selection and the conversion of social risk to social value, and then it can be a great benefit for your project. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chelsea. And thank you to all three panelists this morning. This has been an interesting conversation. And I know that, not one single approach or process will really be what's needed within these engagements. But sort of through the next 15, 20 minutes as we sort of dive into the Q&A. Hopefully we can, dive into that a little bit more. So just a reminder for folks, please feel free to post your questions into the Q&A box below. And if we don't get a chance to answer them today, we definitely will follow up. And the responses will be posted on the Alberta Innovates Small Modular Reactor Learn How webpage, as well as presentations from today and previous sessions will be posted there as well. So, one of the first questions I'd like to dive into, and this kind of goes back to a little bit about what Allison was saying, and sort of, the ability within the EFL to test out some of these different tools that can be used for difficult conversations. And I'd be curious to see, Allison, from your point of view, have some of the fellows taken those tactics back and applied them within sort of their work environment, or within different engagement sessions that they have. And then Desiree and Chelsea, for you guys, have you seen examples through your work of how those difficult conversations have actually occurred, and maybe how they've been moderated or facilitated and such. So Alison, if I can maybe pass it over to you first to address this one.
Sure, certainly. Yeah, I mean, we certainly hear lots of stories and examples of people that have experienced, like whether it's the fellows or in communities as well, of recognizing that, oh, this engaging in this way feels different, and it's actually, while it can be very difficult sometimes, it can feel, for one thing, people kind of showing up as kind of human first is kind of part of as people first, right? And kind of inviting not just the kind of professional perspective into the room, but that kind of personal perspective as well, I think is a big part of the trust building that then sets that solid foundation for being able to kind of lean into these really difficult conversations together. And so we hear lots of examples and stories from fellows and from communities that we've worked with of like, oh, I took it to our group of counselors when we meet, or I applied it at this community meeting, or I took this technique. I really liked how you guys did this, and I went and applied it with my team at work. So we hear a lot of that happening, which I think, is really encouraging to me, because I think in these spaces where we're trying to do something new for the first time, it's, and I was really encouraged by hearing Desiree and Chelsea's perspectives as well on engaging early and the really importance of that, really taking that like broad stakeholder view and inviting that diversity of kind of perspective and thought into the room, and really thinking about, because I think that's the foundation for how we can then be creative about finding paths forward that works for as many people as possible, which ultimately is I think a fresh way of approaching project development, and is really important in the kind of context and the world that we're in now.
Thanks, Alison. Maybe Chelsea or Desiree, sort of speak from your experience in some of this engagement, when you've encountered some of those difficult conversations, maybe how they went, how they were facilitated, approaches you might have used.
Chelsea, do you mind if I go first?
Oh, no, go ahead, please.
So in my past role as owner of Aberflex, we had just put a new production facility close to a First Nation. Being a First Nation company, as I was the owner, a lot of it, the relationship building took almost 2 years to really get to a comfortable place where we could really start talking about issues and how we were going to employ from the First Nations and how we were going to work together. And it really does take quite a bit of time to build that relationship. It really is. And I love doing it, but I had to be there. I had to be there in the community. I had to be at community events. I had to show my support. And it's not that I didn't, I wasn't fake about it. I was very real and honest about it. I was there to learn more. I'm always looking to learn more. So you need to be really open and honest about why you're there. And like Chelsea said, you need to set the expectation. And sometimes that expectation can't be set until a 2-year mark, when your relationship is really further along than the beginning. So there's also been other items, such as recently in Saskatchewan, a First Nation completely blocked a company from coming in only because they didn't go and talk to them. They didn't have the conversations with the chiefs or the traditional chiefs. So when they went to do a site selection, and they weren't even really there to do any even surveying or science-related items, they were really just there to look, they still had not gone and talked to them. So, and understandable, you're on their territory. So you need to speak to them, and you need to speak to them soon. As for my professional judgment and really speaking from my heart, that's where I see First Nations Power Authority being that bridging gap, or the third party that's neutral. They're not there for one specific company, and they're not there just for the First Nation. They're really in between, trying to educate and bring the knowledge to the people so they can make an informed and educated decision.
So I'll make 2 additional comments. I think my colleagues covered it very well. So the first comment I'll make is at least they're talking. I think that that's an important point as well. I always get a bit nervous when stakeholders all of a sudden go silent, and I think, has the conversation truncated? So even though it's a difficult conversation, at least it's still a conversation. And the second point that I'll make is it's not always obvious what the issue is, which goes further to Desiree's point. If I reflect back on a project that is culminating right now with a community, it's a housing development project. One of the challenges and hurdles to overcome for one of my stakeholders was moving a rose bush, because the rose bush was connected to her late mother. They had planted it together. And I would have never understood and known that had I not opened up my ears to listen to what that challenge really was. It was nothing about the infrastructure that was putting in place. It was nothing about the increased noise, the traffic. It was, will I have my rose bush impacted? And that may seem simple, but it's so relevant and so critical. So the two things are, it may not be as obvious, so we need to open up our ears to genuinely listen. And the second is, at least the stakeholders are talking and not silence. And so that, to me, is a beginning point for a conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, guys. So I've had some questions come in sort of around, I think all three of you kind of had mentioned sort of partnerships and whether that's equity stake and that sort of stuff. And so one of the questions is really around that, right now as SMR technology still hasn't been broadly deployed, it can be expensive to develop and to commercialize. And so, based on some of the experience or what you've seen, what are some of the financing models that might be preferred for technology development? Is it private financing only with sort of clear policies and regulatory rules? Or are you really sort of seeing some of those private-public partnerships, community ownerships, PPAs? Sort of what are you seeing happening, let's say specifically in sort of the SMR space at the moment?
So I can kick off that conversation. So you're absolutely right. I think it's an exploration right now in the SMR space because it is so new. But maybe I can reflect on some other projects that we've helped clients with that have been successful. And some of them may be a surprise, the avenues that we've taken. So one, for example, was working with communities. Sometimes the community doesn't always have the resources to buy in from an equity share perspective. And so I've actually seen companies do things like administer shares. And of course, I understand that the organizational structure and governance structure internally needs to be so that can be done. But even things like RSUs, so restricted share units, because what you don't want happening as well is providing shares in a community, taking the capital out when your intended purpose was to have the community as a partner. So that's one avenue that I've seen be successful. Another one that may seem may seem simple, but equally as effective, is that we've worked with communities to incubate businesses that may not be connected to SMR development or may not be connected to the development that we're helping our client with. And the intention there is to have value back to the community, not to have the community work for your project. And so that's an interesting turn and one that isn't always considered, but for example, a business incubation program that may help somebody in community that already has a business that they're trying to lift off the ground, that they're really interested in doing. They love the work that they're doing already. They just need a little extra help, almost like a Dragon's Den help, right? That's a way that companies can help support and provide value into the community when it may not be connected to the work that you are doing. So just thinking a bit more creatively in that respect, I think is very powerful, because now you're genuinely helping community, not just helping yourself as an organization.
Desiree, maybe I'll see if you would like to respond at all.
Sure, absolutely. Chelsea, I would just like to say that Hatch has done a great job in most communities that they go into. They're well known to be leaders in that engagement space, not just with Indigenous and First Nations people, also with communities. So thank you. In regards to funding and ownership, there are lots of different ways that this can happen. Like Chelsea had alluded to, right? There's that shareholder and handing out shares, but there's also the partnership or even ownership. If a company comes in and wants to set up a small modular reactor in a community, the actual community can actually be the owner of it, whereas they come in as a partner. So they're the ones running it. They're the ones trained on it. And like Chelsea had said, a lot of times there are businesses that start up around that. So it's not specifically for that SMR, but maybe it's to do with parts, or coming forward with building small modular reactors. It's going to need to be done in a manufacturing facility. It could be setting up manufacturing facilities for parts for small modular reactors. So there's a lot of different ways that First Nations can be involved. A lot of it I see is education, and I do see that the government, whether it's federal or provincial, will have to step in at some point and help out with the dollars to start this, right, as it is a new technology. So there's going to be a really wide mix, and I think every community is going to be different.
Wonderful. Allison, did you want to add any comments on this one?
No, I think Desiree and Chelsea well covered it. Thanks.
Okay, awesome. So the next question that's coming in is sort of, around whether or not Alberta land legislation and designation regulations include SMR development, or does it fall into existing development activities? And so Chelsea or Desiree, I don't know if you have any insight into this one. If not, this is definitely something we can follow up after the session.
Maybe dig a bit deeper into that, Maureen. Do you mean regulatory requirements for consultation?
That's a great question. Maybe I can ask Aurora, who submitted this one, if you can just maybe provide a bit more guidance to us on this. We can definitely come back to it. So then maybe on that note, maybe the next question, I'd like to pose is, I think in Alberta, we have great examples of various types of engagement, community, Indigenous, with large energy projects. And I'm thinking particularly around sort of some of the work that goes on within the oil sands. And so based on your perspective, when it comes more to the SMR side of things, do you foresee the need to make any changes in how that engagement occurs because of the specific technology? Or again, I would say, because this is an emerging technology and we maybe have a chance here to do things differently and to really kind of, let's call it, do the engagement right, what would be the best approach, from your guys' perspective that you'd like to see different developers take?
I see this as not one specific developer, as maybe a collective, just because there are going to be so many different communities, and there's so many if we think about the technology in Canada alone, currently right now, there's 4 or 5 different developers of different small modular reactor technology. With that being said, how do you make sure that every First Nation is covered? How do you make sure, it almost seems to me like it might have to be a government collaboration with either a not-for-profit, or such as First Nations Power Authority, or another one, or a couple of them, to really roll this out. Now, I know NRCan does have their small modular reactor roadmap, which they're planning on doing a lot of different engagement, and they've already started. And yes, I think it's great that we're talking about this now, as it is early, but at the same time, we say early, within the next 4 years, we expect that small modular reactor to be running. So to build a relationship with every single First Nations in Canada, in Alberta alone, it's a bit of a task. So I feel like it's going to have to be a real joint effort between industry, government, and education, just educating people on the different types, varieties, and the energy mix, that is the possibilities.
So in addition to that, I would say that Canada's oil sands producers have done a great job with consultation. You know, as I've worked across the country now and internationally on projects, I always reflect back to the beginning of my career when I did start in Canada's oil sands, and look back on projects like, you know, Cenovus's housing project where they're helping the Cold Lake Indigenous communities, or Suncor's East Tank Farm Equity Share project. And so I think when we reflect back on inclusion and consultation, I really think that there are, you know, quite a few oil sands producers that are doing a great job in that respect. So, you know, I say kudos to them. I would also say that when it comes to, you know, consultation activity, the things that we need to worry about or at least pay attention to is this idea of emerging technology. So the one challenge that I foresee for Alberta is that we're not a nuclear province. And so there may not be a comfort or a level of understanding with stakeholders, whether they be Indigenous communities or government regulators, industry for that matter. And there needs to be some work and sweat equity put into that understanding that nuclear is safe. And I think in other jurisdictions that I've worked in, like Ontario, for example, very open to nuclear development. It is a huge supplier of energy in that province. And so the appetite for it may be stronger there just because there is a higher comfort level. So if I'm thinking about consultation and engagement, I think that really is the one thing that needs to be stressed, is that because this is an emerging technology and because this isn't a nuclear-centric province, there's a bit of groundwork that needs to be done in that respect. But when it comes to consultation of oil sands producers, I have to give a thumbs up, because from what I've seen either across the country and in certain jurisdictions around the globe, I really think that Alberta is leading on a lot of these fronts.
Thanks, Chelsea. I'll just add, Maureen, I like that phrase, you know, do we have an opportunity here to kind of do engagement right? Because I think the answer to that is yes, in that, you know, we're talking about a new technology where there is more of a runway. And at the same time, I think in the context, what we've been noticing working with communities around the province over the last 5 or 6 years is a marked shift in the last couple of years where the kind of nature of the conversation has been moving more from, you know, I guess maybe stronger kind of resistance to this idea of like, oh, things are changing and we don't know where we sit in this, and a lot of discomfort and kind of fear around that, to more of like kind of an all hands on deck, and like we recognize the world's changing and we want to be part of that. And there's this real like kind of leaning into wanting to kind of explore and find opportunities at that community level for how communities can really kind of benefit from and be part of the energy future we're creating. And of course, that's at a whole kind of suite of diversification opportunities. And so I think part of what I very much agree with what Chelsea and Desiree have shared as well around there's a big sort of education component, and of course very important to, it's not, I would kind of caution around purely engaging on a technology, but it's like that it's engaging around genuinely what does the community need and want, and then how might that technology fit into that vision? How might there be sort of ways of proceeding in a project that truly kind of benefits as many people in the community as possible, and really making that the focal point of the engagement, as opposed to how do we get this project built, which, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. So Aurora has sort of come back with some additional information here. And so really what she's looking for on that land use questions is, you know, whether or not or how will local governments maybe consider SMR developments within municipal development plans and use, you know, existing bylaws in order to sort of update existing zoning. So I guess maybe the question is, you know, have you seen that in order for SMRs to be deployed, new regulations or bylaws have needed to come in to enable part of that facilitation? And I recognize that it might not be directly related to engagement, but you know, it's sort of engaging with sort of those government or municipality folks.
Sure. I think that there's two things that need to be considered. The first thing that needs to be considered is, what are the regions that you're going to service with your SMR technology? So understanding that there's infrastructure that needs to be built around it, but are you building around certain areas that may even draw on the energy that's produced from SMR technology, or are you, exporting it in other regions or even perhaps other provinces, or even international jurisdictions for that matter. So that's something to consider from a municipality perspective. The second thing to consider from a municipality perspective, and this is a regulatory requirement, is the emergency evacuation zone. And so that's not meant to be alarmist in any respect. That's for every project that we work on, not just SMR development, but there is an emergency evacuation plan, of course, that has to take place. And so you really need to consider the infrastructure to support that emergency evacuation plan when you're thinking about site selection and when you're thinking about community. And this is above and beyond what I already said about, working with municipalities, regulators, governments, so on my previous slides. But those are a couple things to consider when you're thinking about encouraging SMRs to come into your community, is being able to support the needs that they have from a regulatory compliance perspective.
Just to add a little bit to that as well, I know that NRCan is currently updating their nuclear waste policy, and there's actually discussion papers out, and they are looking for people to comment and help them revamp, revitalize, and bring that policy up to date, as I know it was written, I believe, 1969. So they're currently looking at that policy and looking for comment on it. They do have a whole website. If you do want to comment, or if you want to read their discussion papers, add some information. I know that they're looking at different language to use within their policy and different groups, because before, along with different technology, none of that was around back then, right? So they are looking for input. So please go to the NRCan website in regards to their discussion policies on radioactive waste.
Wonderful. Thank you, Desiree. So we've got about maybe 5 minutes here. So I just want to acknowledge that there was some sort of feedback that came in when we were talking about the different financial models and the potential opportunity that maybe this includes sort of what the gentleman calls sort of a basic income for people who become involved in entrepreneurial, incubator programs that helps to develop sort of creative ideas that might be represented by the stakeholder community. And that these incubator ideas may succeed at launching further environmentally beneficial businesses, and then also successfully launch businesses, would free these individuals from what might be a current low income state. And so I couldn't sort of agree more with that. I think, that's part of our hope as we start to put in new technologies, is that it opens up the opportunity for who can sort of participate in sort of this low carbon or lower carbon energy sort of future. So without trying to put you guys back into repeating what you've already said, but if you had to leave the audience, with a key message or two when it comes to just engagement or having difficult conversations, what would your message be? And sorry, so that you guys don't interrupt each other. Desiree, why don't you go first?
Sure. So my key message would be, obviously, the early adoption, early engagement is always key. And education. Education is going to be the tool that moves us all forward. And it's really that nuclear 101 and not just one specific item. This is one of those tools to help you, obviously, right? That's what we're here for. But education is going to be the key.
Thank you, Desiree. Chelsea.
Yeah, so I have 2 points that leaps off of what I had said earlier, which is number one, do your homework. So understand when you're thinking about site selection, social risk and social value, to understand the areas that you have a greater appetite to go into to develop SMR technology. So that's number one. Number two is implement with creativity. And the willingness to understand and learn. It's not always obvious. The solution isn't always obvious right in front of you, and sometimes it's not even connected to the project that you're implementing. So take the time to understand who your stakeholders are, who your interested parties are, and what is really driving their concern. And that does take a bit of time to do, but it's time well spent.
Yeah, jumping from that, I'll say talk less and listen more, and really aim to meet, to really listen deeply to what the needs and desires of a particular community are, and then engaging with them in thinking creatively about how we might address some of those concerns, or really support making some of those opportunities come into reality, similar to what Chelsea's suggesting there. I think that's really important. It's we tend to think about more of the sort of hard plans and the technical challenges of implementing a project, and it's equally important to think about some of those softer pieces that are going to make it really work in the community context. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, ladies. I love those key messages. Creativity, listening, educating, I feel are so key. Particularly when you have sort of emerging technologies coming in, and what we're trying to do within sort of this energy transition space. And Desiree, you mentioned, the Nuclear 101. And so just a reminder for folks that are attending, if you did not attend sort of the first session where we did sort of dive into that SMR 101, you can log into the Innovate's Unbound platform and access it based on sort of attending this webinar. So that will be available on demand anytime when you'd like to view it. So with that, I would like to move into our wrap up of the SMR Learning Series, where we're going to be hosting our closing panel with some final thoughts from Cameron Brown from the Government of Alberta, Wendell Clausen from TC Energy, and John Zhao from Alberta Innovates. Cameron is the Director of Environment and Technology Integration at Alberta Energy. He heads the unit responsible for providing policy advice and technical expertise on the integration of Alberta environmental policy, as well as emerging technology into Alberta's electricity system. As part of this broader portfolio, Cameron has been asked to lead the Department of Energy's understanding and engagement on small modular reactors as a potential energy resource in both electricity and Alberta's larger resource economy. Wendell is Director of Market Services and Compliance at TC Energy. He is responsible for managing all commercial matters, including regulatory, environmental, and compliance for TC Energy electricity generating fleet. Wendell has 25 years of experience in the electricity industry and has held various roles with SaskPower and North Point Energy. John is Vice President of Clean Resources at Alberta Innovates. He is responsible for Alberta's strategic research and investments in clean resources, including advanced hydrocarbons, clean tech, water and land, smart agriculture, and bioindustrial materials. John has 28 years of research, development, and management expertise in the energy industry and environmental management, with 7 U.S. patents in these fields. He spent 2 years working in nuclear energy at Ontario Hydro before joining the Alberta Research Council in 1990. So with that, Cam, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Maureen. Lots of questions in the chat about the province's plans for SMR, work that's happening with SMRs, how various regulatory regimes will interact. So I thought I'd cover that a little bit in my comments, and hopefully that answers some questions. And we'll certainly go through people's questions, and anything I don't get to, we'll respond to after the fact. When it comes to Alberta, Alberta Innovates and the Department of Energy are jointly leading the province's efforts on SMRs. You'll be hearing from John a little bit later, so I won't steal his thunder. But Innovates is our experts on all things technology and research. And Energy is the arm of government that would be thinking about provincial policy in the area. So as you heard, I believe it was last session, Alberta's Minister of Energy, Sonia Savage, reiterated Alberta's commitment to joining an MOU that exists between Saskatchewan, Ontario, and New Brunswick on SMRs. And if you want to learn a little bit more about what Innovates and Energy have been working on to date, I'd invite everybody to look up Canada's SMR Action Plan, because we co-authored basically Alberta's chapter of that. But beyond that, I wanted to start at the beginning a little bit. I think governments often like to pretend like they're experts on everything all the time. And pulling back the curtain a bit, it probably doesn't come as a surprise, is Alberta has a little innate nuclear expertise. We have never hosted a commercial nuclear facility in the province. So it wasn't as though the Department of Energy had a legion of engineers that were versed in nuclear technologies. But what we were starting to see in Canada is places like Saskatchewan, Ontario, and New Brunswick, who certainly in the power sector operate very differently. They run their crown corporations. They have public bodies in those provinces that decide on the technologies they were looking at, and we're beginning to seriously explore small modular reactors. And it was a very logical opportunity for Alberta to engage in the even though it'll be different in the province. If an SMR is going to be employed here, it will be because of a private investors decided that's a technology that they're going to pursue. But there's two ways the province could tackle that. We could sit back and wait and assume that everything's figured out, or we could proactively begin to start understanding these technologies and think about how regulatory regimes would interact with each other. And obviously, Alberta is choosing the more proactive route. And so we're starting at the beginning. The first thing you need to understand is you don't know what you don't know. And so I just wanted to thank Alberta Innovates for everything they continue to do, including this learning series. I have learned things in this series that I didn't previously know. But more importantly, it's been our first real opportunity to listen to the questions people in Alberta have as we begin thinking about our own plans in the SMR space. So, the perspective of attendees here has been enormously useful. I also wanted to take the opportunity to thank my colleagues in Saskatchewan, Ontario, and New Brunswick, many of whom you heard from, I think it was in the second session. So last August, Alberta announced our intention to join the MOU, and I really wanted to thank my colleagues because they're not waiting for Alberta to sign on the dotted line. They've already been, over the past 6 months, very useful. Answering a lot of our questions. For all the reasons I previously said, they're a bit farther down this road than we are. We have all the same technology and regulatory questions that everybody else has, and we didn't have to start from scratch, right? Saskatchewan, Ontario, and New Brunswick already have plans in the works for SMRs. They already have either experience when it comes to New Brunswick and Ontario with the nuclear sector. They already host nuclear facilities. And certainly Saskatchewan's moving in that direction and have been involved in uranium mining for years. So Alberta is learning from those jurisdictions on all of those fronts, and the MOU is all about learning from those jurisdictions. So when Alberta formally signs the MOU, and you heard from Minister Savage in the last session that we plan to do that, that's just going to formalize that working relationship and make that conversation even easier. So when I say energy would think about policy work in the SMR space, what do I mean? And I think our ultimate goal, as I said, it's ultimately going to be private investors in Alberta that determine how quickly SMRs are deployed in the province, whether that's a technology they want to pursue in their individual projects, whatever that project might be. And the attractiveness of SMRs is what you've heard through these sessions, just how flexible they can be. And a lot of applications outside of what you traditionally think of when it comes to nuclear power generation. So, and the other thing you may remember from the first submission is that the Canadian Constitution is clear, and case law is clear, that nuclear is a federal regulatory responsibility. So that makes the process pretty clear for a traditional nuclear plant when you think about it. You're thinking, thousands of megawatts in a standalone power generation facility. You put a ring around that fence and you say, that's a federal responsibility. But think about what you've heard in these sessions to date. A lot of the interest in Alberta is coming in the form of potential oil sands. You heard Minister Savage say oil sands, and we're Alberta. Everybody's thoughts immediately goes to oil sands. but remote communities, remote mining operations. Alberta is developing a mineral strategy that Alberta is home to a lot of minerals that the high-tech sector increasingly needs for batteries and that sort of thing. You think about those operations in Alberta and in a lot of other places in Canada, they'd be very remote. And so maybe an SMR makes sense. Or Alberta being Alberta, an integrated industrial facility. And a lot of interest has been expressed in hydrogen and the potential for SMRs to be developed in that role. And in each of these cases, what that would mean would be a federally regulated SMR would be at the heart of some kind of provincially regulated facility. So we are still fairly in the early stages, but our goal is ultimately to make sure that an investor that was going to look at an SMR has clarity on how those various regimes would interact. And that we aren't figuring out that process through the first project through the gate, and that a lack of clarity on how that would work would not be a barrier to SMR investment in Canada. In Alberta. One of the things I also wanted to check on, say, is because Ontario in particular and New Brunswick and Saskatchewan have their own crown corporations, the first SMR in Canada is not going to be in Alberta. I hate to burst that bubble, but Ontario Power Generation is already well down the road of deploying an SMR in Chalk River in Ontario. So Alberta's goal, and I'll just sort of conclude by saying this, is to not wait for SMRs to come to us, to understand the experience of that first project in another jurisdiction, and first projects if they happen elsewhere in Canada, and to make sure that our system is ready when investors want to look at that technology. And I think I'll conclude my comments there. I've already answered some questions in the chat. More than happy to answer more. But I think with that, I'll hand off to Wendell Klassen at TransCanada. And I just realized I pronounced his last name wrong, even though we specifically talked about that before. So apologies to Wendell, and over to you.
It's all good, Cam. I've been called things much worse. It's all good. Thanks, Cam, for some amazing comments, and it's been a pleasure to work with you, and I can continue to look forward to working with you folks in the department. But I also want to state how great it has been as it relates to these last sessions and Alberta Innovates desire and efforts they've put forward in order to help the education factor and to just get people up to speed as it relates to small modular reactors. And so, as Cam mentioned, ironically enough, it used to be TransCanada. It is now TC Energy. So many people don't understand necessarily that TC Energy is just a different branding and a different name. So we have, aside from the gas pipeline and the liquid pipeline business, we also have a power generation business as well. We've managed up to 16,000 megawatts of generation. To put things into perspective, Alberta has a system that's over 11,000. So we have vast experience in wind, solar, coal, gas, and also nuclear. And so we are extremely bullish as it relates to SMRs and the new technology. And I guess I maybe shouldn't say new because it has been around for quite some time. It's just starting to come into light now, which is extremely encouraging. And I suppose the reason why we are so bullish on SMRs and excited to see where this is going to go, because we are one of those independent power producers, as Cam was talking about, who have been involved in Alberta for 20 plus years, specifically on the cogeneration side, where our current cogeneration facilities, we actually utilize the existing heat from our gas plants to produce electricity, but we also use that and sell that steam to our hosts for multiple different processes, including in situ and gas fractionation and then fertilizer production and those types of things. And that's one of the things that we're super excited about as it relates to SMRs, because not only are SMRs emission-free in terms of their electricity generation, but they also, depending on the technology, can produce an excessive amount of heat which would facilitate these processes that we're mentioning. So we see a great future for SMRs in Alberta for sure, as it relates to the production piece and how that fits in. And we personally are really excited about it as well, because we've been involved in this business for many, many years. And so the interesting thing that Cam had brought up as well, as it relates to independent power producers, is that Alberta has been a deregulated electricity market for over 2 decades now. And it has been proven to be extremely successful with respect to the additional generation that's come on and the needs that are required by Albertans. So that would include residential and commercial and industrial and all of the loads that are required. So then there is a process in place. There also is a market that's functioning extremely well, and the regulations and the permitting and all of those types of things that the government is responsible for is going to be what's critical as it relates to SMR and the future of SMR development within Alberta, to ensure that the process is made so that these types of things can be done. And like a good functioning market, when the right signals are in place, then the correct investment will be soon to follow. And so, we obviously are heavily involved in Indigenous communications, consultations with communities, and then the education piece. We've been involved in that for quite some time, just in general, as it relates to the multiple projects that we have, not only on the power side, but also on the pipe development side. And so we're excited to get into this world, and we're learning about the technology that apparently is a number of years away, but we all know how time quickly can pass. And so we want to make sure that we have both feet on the ground, not only as a company, but also as a province, to ensure that the right processes are in place so that this investment can come through. And then the wonderful thing as well is, the bullish factor around TC Energy as well. We feel that it has such a great value as it relates to the fill-in for the renewable sector. Obviously, the renewable generation is critical in the moving forward as it relates to the Alberta initiatives for net zero in the future, and also the recent announcement by the federal government as it relates to the healthy economy and healthy environment process. So what small modular reactors do, and most of you have heard this already in previous sessions, is that it fills in the gap for the times where the renewable power are not able to generate. And so not only is it emission free, but it also fills a very unique void that very, very few generators can actually fulfill. And this fuel type of nuclear, we feel, is a great fit for the industry and specifically for Alberta. And like Cam said, we look forward to being a very fast second mover in this technology. So being cognizant of the time, I'll leave it from there, as I could ramble on for quite some time about how excited we are about this. So I'll pass it on to John to close things out for the session. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Wendell. Good morning, everyone. It is truly my pleasure to bring the SMR Learn How series to a close. The purpose of this series was to share the knowledge on the current state of SMR technologies, highlight projects and initiatives underway across Canada, and understand the engagement and the regulatory processes and assess SMR development opportunities for Alberta. Over 300 people actually registered for each of the 4 sessions, which illustrate how much interest we have in this series, in this knowledge sharing. Thank you for the audience for being very active participants through the group chatting and by submitting your questions. So I watched actually 3 sessions, first 3 sessions over the weekend. And I was very impressed by the technology advancement, the government commitments, and regulatory work in the way. SMR is no longer something in the future. We can feel it. It's happening now. I'm equally impressed by today's speakers. Edison, of course, shared EFL's experience holding difficult conversations in energy transition. I have first-hand experience as one of the first EFL fellows. Desiree's passion in bringing reliable, clean energy to the First Nations, and her first-hand experience in engaging First Nations and winning their support. Chelsea, of course, shared Hatch's practical approach to community and stakeholder engagement and site selection. And Cam is thinking ahead already, thinking from the investor's point of view, and get Alberta ready for the SMR investment. Of course, Wendell presented TC Energy as a potential operator and ready to be, the first to the second. So I certainly learned a lot, and I hope you have too. So I really want to give a big thank you to Candace Patton for organizing this Learn How series and bringing an impressive group of speakers. I think we probably had about 25 of them altogether. And thanks to Maureen Kohler for stepping in and moderating the last two sessions. And, we probably should really give Candace, Maureen, and all speakers a virtual applause. And Alberta certainly has tremendous experience and a capacity in developing large energy projects. The supply chain that support these large energy projects can also support the deployment of SMRs across the country. Equally important is the government support. I think Minister Savage's opening remarks at the third session and Cam's remarks today are very good indication of that. Alberta has a great research and innovation sector. When connected to the other research initiatives across Canada, it could help in advancing and deployment of SMRs across Canada. When we have done what we have done in this SMR series, best exemplify Alberta Innovates as a connector, as a convener. We bring together research and innovation players to reduce barriers and increase adoption and spread of innovations. Our programs and activities are aligned with the priorities of the government. So I will finish my concluding remarks by inviting researchers, technology providers, and the project developers to work with us. Alberta Innovates can assist you in connecting with industry and community end users, government departments and agencies, and supporting your research and demonstration project. Thank you all again. Enjoy the rest of your day.